Antoine, can you give us a brief introduction to how you became a small-time thug and a crazy hyena?
As I've always repeated to the Chinese diplomats, there is a public debate in France on China. Everyone is welcome to participate to it, including the Chinese diplomats. So I will be more than glad to interact and debate with them.
The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. If you have ever set foot into an international relations class, you will likely remember this great quote from the Melian dialogue in Thucydides History of the Peloponnesian War. And yet, despite this realist mantra, strong states do not always muscle their way diplomatically to get what they want. Sometimes, they decide their best strategy is to lay low and bid for their time. This was China's policy for years after the Tiananmen massacre. But it seems we have witnessed in the past few years a shift towards a more forceful form of diplomacy, as China no longer fears strong-arming and threatening its critics. This new generation of diplomats, journalists, and politicians have been dubbed the War Warriors, after the 2015 movie War Warrior, where elite People's Liberation Army soldiers defeated foreign mercenaries. So, to paraphrase the great music group Baha Men, today we ask, who let the wolves out? And to answer that question, we are very glad to have Janka Oertel and Antoine Bondaz. To show you how easy it is to file a claim with Geico, no, I'm kidding, we have no ads on this show. But if you want to show your support and help us keep building this podcast, you can really help us with small things, like rating the show, or even better, writing a review. They always put a smile on our faces. If you are new to the show, you can subscribe to and share the pod with your friends and family. Whatever you can do to help the war efforts. Now, on to the show.
Well, to talk about this very important issue, we are very lucky to have two expert China watchers. Dr. Janka Oertel is the director of the Asia program at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a former senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund's United States Asia program. You recently authored Home Advantage, How China's Protected Markets Threatens Europe's Economic Power. Antoine Bondaz is a research fellow at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, where you cover issues relating to China and the Koreas, and you're also a professor at Sciences Po. He's also, according to the Chinese embassy in Paris, a small-time thug and a crazy hyena. So before we dive into the issue of war diplomacy, Antoine, can you give us a brief introduction to how you became a small-time thug and a crazy hyena?
So basically, it was very nice remark and insults that the Chinese embassy in France addressed actually to me a few weeks ago. They reacted actually to some of my tweets and research on Taiwan actually. And the main objective was basically to discredit my research and try to avoid discussing the content of it. And that's why, according to me, it's quite counterproductive actually from the Chinese diplomats to do so. First, it's unprecedented to attack someone only on his person and not on his work and research, actually. And second, it has been very counterproductive because the answer from the French authorities, from the political class, from the media, from the academia, has been unanimous, actually, in condemning these remarks. So very counterproductive. It's not changing anything. Actually, it's not impacting me in any way in my research. And as I've always repeated to the Chinese diplomats, there is a public debate in France on China. Everyone is welcome to participate to it, including the Chinese diplomats. So I will be more than glad to interact and debate with them.
Fantastic. Thank you for those few words, Antoine. So let's dive into the topic of war diplomacy. First of all, can you define what war diplomacy in the first place, and how does it manifest itself across Europe? And when did it start? And to some extent, how does it contrast with China's more traditional diplomatic posturing? Janka first.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me on here. It's a great pleasure to be here with Antoine and with you guys. So maybe if we define war diplomacy first, is like the name in and of itself, it dates back to a movie that was shot at a Chinese movie that was shot in a kind of US action film style, with Chinese being like Chinese being the hero of it, and it has this kind of very aggressive but also very active tone of defending China. So I think this is where the name comes from. But what we are seeing right now is not something that is entirely new. This is not something that hasn't been there before. In its kind of extent, it is new. And over the course of the pandemic, you have seen these massive efforts in controlling the narrative around the pandemic, around the coronavirus. And that has certainly led to a spike in this kind of activity. But while the term itself wasn't present before, the policies of picking off individual countries or individual players and being more assertive with them diplomatically is something that we've seen in the past as well. This is not something that we haven't seen before at all.
Yeah, I think what is quite important is that it's a new trend, but it's not a new one. In the sense that you have lots of reform, lots of policies that basically hinted to such a more aggressive rhetoric from the Chinese diplomats. And I think we need to get back in time, at least to 2013, when Xi Jinping, in a major conference on external propaganda and ideology, asked actually to the Chinese authorities and the diplomats, but not only the diplomats, to, I quote, methodically carry out external propaganda, innovate in this field, make efforts to create new expressions, new concepts, and new examples to, I quote, better tell China's story and make China's voice heard. So this is basically the start of major reform program in China, the reform of the public TV, CCTV that became CGTN abroad, the massive use of media platform, including YouTube, starting in 2018, 2019. More recently, the massive use of the social network, including Twitter. And just to give you some very basic data, in July 2020, you had at least 150 official accounts, Twitter accounts, linked to Chinese embassies, ambassadors, consulates, consuls, and of course the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Among these 150 Twitter accounts, more than 2/3 had been created in the previous 12 months. So it's something that started mostly in 2019, much before the pandemic, and usually in link with the unrest and the demonstration in Hong Kong. Second, so more Twitter accounts and Twitter accounts that are much more active. To give you just one data, the activity of the Twitter accounts of the Chinese embassy in France increased by 1,000% between December 2019 to May 2020. And the objective is quite clear. The Chinese authorities want to make sure that the Chinese narrative is being discussed abroad and, if possible, becomes mainstream abroad. So that's basically the objective. And the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy is just a tool to achieve that end. If it's counterproductive, yes, if we focus on the public opinion and if you believe that the objective is to seduce and to convince the foreign audience, it is not counterproductive if the objective is mostly a domestic one, that is to portray the image of the Chinese diplomacy as a key institution, let's call it this way, to defend what is called more and more in China the so-called national dignity, to ask for the respect of the Chinese as a nation and as a culture, etc. And this is not counterproductive in that way. And you can see it in the like the public opinion survey in China, you can see it in the press. The objective, once again, is to portray an image of strength, of power abroad, much more than to seduce the foreign audience.
So, Janka, what do you make of this argument that this warfare diplomacy is mainly for domestic consumption? Is there something we're missing? Maybe this aggressive form of diplomacy works up sometimes. You know, maybe Antoine's case is one of the exceptions where it completely backfires. But are there cases where this muscular form of diplomacy works abroad, or is it only creating bad blood and it's only there for domestic reasons? Janka.
Well, I wouldn't say it's only creating bad blood. It also creates a degree of it scares off, and it does raise a problem, particularly among smaller countries or individuals that are just not capable of fully taking on this kind of anger that is directed against them, and it does have an impact on policy choices. One could argue that some of these instances should have led to a much stronger joint European response, pushing back, really clearly pointing out. But that's not necessarily what happened. What did happen is that many of the countries have been taking on these challenges individually. I think the Swedish case is a good example here, where there's a lot of bullying going on from the Chinese embassy in Sweden. But at the same time, Sweden is not really calling for a joint European response here, not calling really for assistance from other countries. Everyone is sort of still trying to deal with this individually, and that's quite remarkable, because I do think that what we are seeing here is, from the Chinese side, just as Antoine says, mainly directed at a domestic audience, but it is taking these kind of side effects into account and is using them for broader political purposes. And I do think that we need to look into what the reasons behind this behavior are. And while it's really difficult to depict that always very clearly, and there are probably there's no monocausal answer here. There's no one answer why the Chinese side has decided to shift gears on its diplomacy. But there is a mix of kind of a certain degree of panic, a certain degree of consciousness, of self-consciousness, of being very confident about the Chinese approach, anger about the way the Chinese leadership has been treated, particularly by the US side, but also this kind of seizing the moment of opportunity here with regard to kind of taking a calculated risk when it comes to dealing with the Europeans, because that is part of a broader strategy to just keep the Europeans non-aligned with the United States, keep them in a certain degree of suspense, and make sure that they're not fully uniting against each other. We see in public opinion that there is a backlash, but not necessarily in government behavior. I'm sitting here in Berlin, and we are looking at government consultations towards the end of the month, bilateral government consultations between Germany and China. The mood between the governments seems to be still okay. So I think we have to be very nuanced here in what this means.
Yeah. The follow-up to what Janka said, and I fully agree with her, actually. The key question for the Chinese authorities is to know whether that backfire in terms of public opinion is translating or not into public policies. And so far, there is no translation. That impact on the public opinion is unprecedented. Let's be clear. If we get the data from the Pew Research Center in Spain, Germany, Canada, the Netherlands, the US, the UK, South Korea, Sweden, or even Australia, the negative views on China have reached their highest level in the 12 years that institute, the Pew Research Center, has been polling in these countries. So clearly, it's very negative impact. Yet, you do not have so far a clear shift in terms of public policies. You may say you have one in Australia, in the US, etc., but then it would be unrelated to that kind of drop in terms of favorable opinion to China. The key question now in Europe is that whether in the short term and in the medium term, that shift in terms of public opinion will translate into additional pressure on the political authorities and translates eventually into new public policies. And if you take the example of France, something that has been striking in 2020 is that if the French government has been very vocal on the issue of Xinjiang and human rights abuses in the autonomous region, that's mostly because the civil society mobilized. That's mostly because you had that grassroots level, if you can call it this way, mobilization from NGOs, from some politicians, but mostly from the youth people that forced actually authorities to take a hard stance. So the key question, once again, is whether that shift into public opinion will translate into mobilization by the civil society, pressure on the public authorities, and at the end of the day into new public policies. But that's why I fully agree with Janka when she said that we have to be very nuanced about the how counterproductive if the warfare diplomacy.
I wanted to follow up here on what Antoine suggests as this sort of like lag between the policies that we're seeing the EU implement in terms of the conflict with China and the actual facts on the ground, right? What a lot of scholars are calling the non-kinetic warfare that autocratic states are increasingly waging. And Antoine, you seem to suggest that the EU is yet to fully take stock of this new set of facts on the ground, and we're yet to see that reflected on EU policy. And I wanted to focus specifically on the way that we've discussed China over, say, the past 5 to 10 years in Europe has really come almost primarily through the lens of human rights, right? Things that we object as Europeans, things that are happening inside China, things that China influences worldwide, and things that we as Europeans find reprehensible. And I wonder to what extent that has come at the expense of a broader understanding of the conflict, one that the Americans have oftentimes criticized in Europe, which is not being able to see how the economic abuses and the human rights abuses really are embedded in one another. Really, they interpenetrate one another. And the EU was perhaps unknowingly really an actor and a player in the trade wars and the rebalancing of the trade postures between Donald Trump's America and China. And I wonder, you've got a fascinating report out just, I believe, last week, Janka. You've got this new ECFR paper that looks at what you call the protected home market advantage. That really is one of the points of contention in the investment agreement that the EU passed late last year in a really rushed manner. One of the things that European companies had been complaining for a long time was the sense that Chinese companies were systematically advantaged by domestic policies, and that there was a need for a broad investment agreement to rebalance those reports. I wonder how would you assess the balance between the human rights abuses and the economic abuses and the way that we're tackling China? I mean, it does seem like COVID is enhancing that embeddedness. When I think of, for instance, the way that China went about the COVID disinformation campaigns, right? Trying to erase and really trying to whitewash its role in helping the virus spread. That's, I think, one specific instance where you see the two coming together. The reason that the kind of staged these disinformation campaigns was that they wanted to whitewash the economic damage from the virus, but that comes tied with all of a whole host of human rights issues as well, and the way that those disinformations have also concerned Xinjiang and whatnot. So I wonder how do you assess the balance of the two, and do you think there's an issue in the way that the EU still hopes to compartmentalize the two when the two prongs of the problem are more connected than we tend to think? And I want to start with Janka, and hopefully you can prime some of the aspects in your report.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So I think this is, we have to maybe untangle that a little bit. What is important is that there is a difference in kind of the very comprehensive systemic rivalry, strategic rivals for global power approach of the United States, and the still relatively compartmentalized approach that the European Union is still taking when it comes to China. And that's not just the EU, or particularly not the EU, for the member states themselves that wish for this distinction to exist. The European member states, and particularly Germany, where I sit, wants to be able to say we have a human rights dialogue with China, where we are tackling all the difficult questions that are on the agenda. And I think, to be very fair, Germany has been one of the countries that has been very straightforward when it comes to human rights questions, has been helping human rights lawyers, has been helping on individual cases. The German Chancellor has been very outspoken on the human rights situation in various instances. At the same time, German companies have been making a lot of money in China, and they wish to continue to do so in the future. And that is, and then the kind of the last element is kind of the diplomatic relationship, where there is this general notion that we can cooperate with China. This holy trinity of EU-China relations that has become this systemic rival, but also economic competitor, but also negotiation partner. trinity that we've been working with, which means sort of in the end nothing, because it's all of the above. It's kind of a, everyone can pick whatever they would like approach to it. And so I think the Europeans are increasingly realizing that despite the fact that they would like for relations to be that way, China doesn't see it that way. China sees the relationship in a very comprehensive fashion and will retaliate or will kind of address the issues across the board. And so I do think that we are increasingly going to see these agendas just kind of colliding. We saw that very much around the Xinjiang sanctions that the EU has imposed on China. This was the first time that human rights related sanctions were imposed since 1989. It was quite a step for the European Union to take. You had unity among all 27 member states to go ahead with this, which is quite remarkable as well, given that we were always kind of saying, well, the Europeans are so ununited when it comes to China. So it was possible to have these sanctions. Very modest, very limited in scope, but there was a fierce reaction from the Chinese side that attacked the Europeans in kind of signing on to this coordinated approach of sanctions with the US and the UK and Canada. And so I think this is something where we are seeing that this is putting companies, European companies, in a difficult bind, because the response was also that there were boycotts, coordinated boycott calls in Chinese state media against European companies. And increasingly, European companies are going to find themselves having to decide whether they are going to be willing to take into, or whether they are going to be willing to live with the backlash that they're receiving at home, or risk their China business. And this is going to be different for each sector. There's going to be different solutions for each of these companies. But it's going to get harder and harder. This magical third way that the Europeans have somehow decided that they would love to take when it comes to China, I just don't see it existing. And so I think for Europe, it is really high time to get very realistic what the areas are in which one can move forward with China, and how a kind of the decoupling tendencies that are emanating from Beijing, they have to be incorporated in a new strategy.
Yeah, if I may add some elements. The human rights violation in China are nothing new, of course. But the situation still is quite different now. First thing is that human rights violations, especially in Xinjiang, are much more severe now than they were 5 or 10 years ago. Second one is that they are, even though not perfectly, but much more documented than a few years ago. And third, they are much more openly criticized as a few years ago. On that very specific topic on international criticism toward China, I think the EU has been for quite some years quite not exemplary, but at least has been trying to take the lead. When I say the EU, is not necessarily, of course, the Commission. But if you see the resolution voted and adopted at the European Parliament, if you remember that in late 2019, it's Ilham Tohti who got awarded with the Sakharov Prize on Human Rights by the European Parliament. If you see all of the questions raised by either MEPs or MPs in national assemblies, etc., the European parliamentarians have been very active. It has started to translate into public policies much more recently, as Janka perfectly said. What is new also is that before closing, or at least turning a blind eye to human rights violation in China was fine, or at least criticizing openly China was still fine. Right now, many companies, many countries have to consider that openly criticizing China will have detrimental effects to their interest. If you see the example of what's going on with the ban on export or imports of cotton from Xinjiang and the reaction in China on the de facto boycotts of some big European brands, the message being said by the Chinese authorities is quite clear. It's either you turn a blind eye to what's happening, including in your activities outside of China, including into your other markets, big in the US and European markets, or you will face some retaliation and some economic sanctions. So I think that changes the equation. And China, de facto, is the one asking us to choose between values, ethics, and profits. So that's something that was not happening a few years ago. Then what is also very important that in Europe, many have a debate on what could be done to change Chinese policies in China on human rights, etc. I think that that's a wrong debate. We all agree that the Europeans have very little leverages to force China to change its domestic policies. And I'm not sure this is a main objective. But not being able to really influence Chinese policies does not mean we have to stay complicit or at least do nothing. This is one thing to change China policies, and once again, I think it's very complicated and most of the time unrealistic. But it does not mean that we cannot change our European policies on China. And that's the main question today. The question is not whether we can successfully change China, but what we can do in Europe to change our China policy. And on forced labor, etc., you then have two questions or two debates. The first one is what can we do to end forced labor in China? It's very complicated. And China is not going to commit to either ratify the International Labour Organization Convention on Forced Labor or do anything, especially now and especially before the 100th anniversary of the party. But it does not mean that the EU can do nothing. The EU can do a lot in the way we interact with China, in the way our consumers behave, in the way we can directly or indirectly benefit from forced labor or other issues. And that should be the debate in Europe. It's not only, once again, about changing China, it's how we adapt, how we change our policies to better fit not only our interests, but also the values we promote. Because if we do not do it in Europe, then you have no legitimacy to go abroad and promote values, etc.
So let's talk about a little bit about the relationship between China and Europe on economics. We touched a little bit so far. China has become the main trading partner of the EU in 2020. Despite the pandemic, we saw imports and exports from China rising, which means that nowadays 22.4% of the EU's imports come from China. Now, what we saw quite painfully in the first few months of the pandemic is how dependent we were on Chinese products in a whole wealth of areas, from masks to drugs, and we're not even talking about rare earth materials, for example. And I want to make a bit of a parallel with Australia. Now, obviously, Australia is a smaller country, but its reliance on the Chinese economy had been growing for decades. And now, overnight, this dependence is now being exploited by Beijing, who has slapped tariffs on Australian goods on a whole range of products over its support for an international inquiry into China's handling of COVID. Could we be sleepwalking as Europeans maybe on a smaller scale, but sleepwalking into a similar form of dependency? Janka.
Well, so I think first of all, we have to kind of set the record a bit straight on the Australia example. Obviously, the form of China's economic coercion that it has chosen to deal with the political issues that it has with Australia are quite drastic and are unreasonable from that regard. Some of them are not necessarily illegal because they're kind of borderline still within WTO frameworks, but the impact on the overall Australian economy has not been, it should not be overrated. I think it's really important that just because there's import bans on Australian wine doesn't mean a collapse of the Australian economy. I think that's very, very important to be clear here. And then I do think that while saying that, we have to be very clear that dependencies in other areas that could be exploited, and not in terms of like an overall big sanctions style approach from the Chinese side, but just being able to threaten to cut off Europe from certain supplies that it is growing more dependent on has an enormous potency. So I do think that while we are making choices at the moment for long-term strategic investments, particularly in strategic infrastructure, and I'm thinking about the 5G example here, we have to always keep that in mind. There has been this kind of logic in Europe that China has no interest in doing that when it comes to Europe, that the Chinese leadership is not interested in kind of using its economic power for coercive measures. And that's just simply not true anymore. We're seeing ample examples now of China being willing to just do just that. So there are, just in overall terms, European countries, EU member states, China trade is still not as relevant for them, or not nearly as relevant for them as it is the kind of inter-European trade or the US trade. When it comes to Germany, who is the most kind of intertwined with the Chinese market, has an enormously strong economic relationship. We're still talking like 7% of external trade with China in comparison to 60% roughly within the EU. So just to get the numbers straight here. But there is obviously a trajectory here, and this is something that we try to outline also in the Home Advantage report, is that there is a tendency that we are competing in strategic industries with Chinese companies that are kind of beefed up players on steroids that are, because they have the massive home market that they can rely on and that kind of supports them, allows them massive spending in R&D, allows them massive spending on just producing better products as well at lower prices and at similar or comparable quality at times. And those are competing then with European companies on an international scale. And we could be on the losing end of this. And if we then lose companies because they're just not competitive anymore on the global market, and we lose access to European technology and innovation capacity because of that in strategic sectors, including renewable energies or the telecommunications sector, then that could be a problem in the long term. Just to kind of make it very graphic and very clear, if we cannot produce, if we cannot acquire renewable technology in the wind sector, solar industry, etc., or hydrogen without Chinese tech anymore, then the dependence will grow massively. So it is in Europe's interest to diversify its supply, to diversify also the kind of dependence on the Chinese market, to avoid this kind of risk accumulation that has taken place because of the relationship and because the opportunities for business in China had just been so good for such a long time. I think we're seeing that shift in the industry. We're seeing that realization in the industry. It just takes a bit of time to wean the companies off the kind of dependence on the Chinese market or the promise of the Chinese market, much more so sometimes than the actual Chinese market. And that's something that needs to be strategically addressed by governments. This is not an issue for individual companies. This is a structural issue that has to have a political and not necessarily just an economic solution.
Yeah, I think I would say that many Europeans are kind of sleepwalking on the many challenges posed by China, and at the same time they are daydreaming about the real influence of China and our dependency on China. To get just some data, Australian exports to China in summer 2020 were about 48% of the total of exports. 48% only toward China. In France in 2020, it was only 4%. 48% from Australia, 4% from France. So you have first a huge difference in terms of dependency between countries such as South Korea, Taiwan, and especially Australia, and European economies, because in most of the data, people focus on outside of EU trade, when German trade is mostly and primarily with its EU neighbors. Second, if you take the question of the FDI and Chinese FDI in Europe, in France, Chinese FDI in 2019 created less jobs than Canadian FDI or Spanish FDI, and much less, of course, than Swiss, German, British, or American FDI. But in the public debate, is anyone saying that Canadian investment in France or in Europe, Spanish investment, Swiss investment, UK investment are the key? No one. So I think there is a lot of illusions in the public debate, and the Chinese authorities, to be clear, have been very, very efficient. And then I would say that the same question about the Chinese FDI in Europe, they are very important. They increased a lot until 2016, 2017, before dropping massively, etc. But just one data, you get the French example. In 2019, the Chinese FDI in France created less jobs than the Canadian FDI or than the Spanish FDI in France. But who is talking in the French public debate about Canadian or Spanish investments? No one. So I think there is a lot of illusion on the Chinese, let's say, predominance in the French economy. There is a lot of, let's say, as I say, I mean, many are daydreaming about the real influence of China. It does not mean that there are not challenges. Of course there are, but it means they were much less reliant on China than when we believe. That's the same if you get the French companies or European companies and China. Most of the time, you will interview companies that are either based in China or exporting to China. But many companies that are not in China, that are not exporting to China, are de facto impacted by some Chinese policies. And most of the people are not talking about them, are not researching on them. And most of the time, we don't have a comprehensive view on not only the Chinese influence on the French and European economy, but also the impact of Chinese economic decisions on the whole economic system, the whole economic actors in Europe. And I think that's something that should be addressed. And one of the consequences is not only that there are plenty of challenges, for sure, that our dependency on China is maybe less acute than what we believe, but also that we have a lot of leverages. As we all know, the European Union is the biggest market in the world, that the first trade partner of China, that's today de facto indispensable economic partner to China, and we have plenty of leverages. The problem is not the one of leverages. The problem is the one of the political will to action these leverages. And that's something that should be discussed at the EU level. Once again, we have plenty of leverages. It's not a problem of means. It's a problem of the willingness and the difficulty, of course, to find a cohesion, to use these means to address economic imbalances, etc. And that's something we are not discussing yet, I would say, at the European level.
Yeah, maybe I can I agree fully with Antoine, and I'd just like to add, I think this is again the realization that has to sink in, is that if Europe understands its market power, then the options that are on the table are so different. If it understands its political power, the options are so different. But we continue to stick in this narrative that says, oh, we're getting squeezed between the Chinese and the US, it's terrible, as if Europe had no agency at all. And I do think it's really the first step in addressing the China challenge for Europe is to get out of that mindset and to get the head in the right space that says, well, we can actually do a lot here, we can exert pressure as well. We have to act collectively, and we have to put long-term or short-term economic gains for individual companies or countries aside, and look at like long-term prosperity and long-term strategic goals.
Right. We're nearing the end of our time, but there's perhaps one very brief question, and then we'll end on a sort of a broader one. But the brief question I'd like to ask is something of a different way to approach the same set of issues we've been discussing, which is essentially looking at how they crystallize in specific parts of the continent, specific regions. It looks like the sort of hard-edged economic hand that China's playing, and that you both very expertly described, is very palpable and visible in specific parts of our continent. It so happens that countries that carry a record of financial shortages, infrastructure shortages, that may even have had rough time with COVID, are really on China's radar. And I'm thinking particularly of one specific region that we've been discussing a lot these days, which is the V4. But even broader than the Visegrad countries, we could even lump in Greece, Italy, the Balkans, countries of that nature. And I wonder, whether you've been following the region at all, and what you make of, for instance, zeroing specifically on vaccines. And when you think of a country like Hungary, for instance, which also happens to have a different vaccine procurement strategy, but we've seen them come a lot closer to kind of China's global vaccine strategy. Obviously, lumped in with a whole host of issues with the access of Chinese universities to Hungary, with a renewed military cooperation between Hungary and the Chinese regime, and a whole host of issues that are raising a lot of eyebrows in Brussels. And not just Hungary specifically, but the V4 in Central Europe. Is that a region you're following closely? And what are your concerns that maybe through regions of that sort, China could be getting access into the European space in sort of nefarious ways? We'll start maybe with Antoine and then turn back to Janka.
I think the Chinese influence in Eastern Europe has been very overestimated for the last few years. If you see in terms of economy, of political network, etc., of course, China is an emerging actor and is an actor that 20 years ago had no influence at all. But Chinese current influence, it's quite limited. It's very visible when you have countries like Hungary or else blocking a resolution or a decision at the EU Council level, because of that decision would be detrimental to Chinese interest, and then you can see, of course, the Chinese influence. But overall, I would say that influence has been quite limited. And what the Chinese have been underestimated for years is the proximity between these countries and the US. At the end of the day, the transatlantic relation between Eastern Europe and the US is much more important than the relation between these countries and China. And you can see it because over the last few years, from Poland to the Baltic countries, from Slovakia to Czech Republic, many countries have taken a much harder stance on China than some Western European countries. The second aspect, and I think that even though we are both with Janka working, of course, mostly on China, but the question at the end of the day is, what is the EU doing? It's one thing to blame China. It's something else to address our own shortages. And I really like part of President Macron's speech in 2019, the speech to the ambassador, in which he reminded everyone that China had been a real diplomatic genius in playing our division and weakening us. And this is the problem. The problem is we are part of the problem. China is not the only problem. The problem is the lack of cohesion, is the political opportunity that some countries may seize for whatever reason. And this is something we need to address. And we won't be able to face China. We won't be able to face the many challenges posed by China and other countries if we are not able on our own within Europe to address our own shortages, and to, of course, address the issue that at the end of the day, if we do not move in a very unified and cohesive way, we won't be able to achieve anything. And that's something that should be addressed much more than only criticizing China. Because once again, this is very important to see and to be aware of the issue coming from outside of Europe. But we also need to address, of course, all of the issues and all of the shortcomings we have within Europe.
Maybe if I can provocatively add here, one could argue that Europe has, when it comes to the China dimension, a bigger Germany problem than it has a V4 problem. It has a bigger Germany problem than it actually has a Poland problem in this regard. I think Antoine has pointed that out really nicely. We have to be very careful with taking like entire regions together and their perspectives. And these are very nuanced positions. So I would say Hungary is an outlier, but you can't even say Southeastern Europe, because the differences in the approach to China and also in the relationship to China between Greece or Bulgaria or Romania are just super different from the Czech Republic or Lithuania for that matter. And I think we just have to be very clear that we don't just kind of lump countries together and say, well, this is the Eastern European approach to China, or this is Southeastern European approach to China. It just doesn't work anymore. There's a lot of nuance installed here. There's a lot of changes that are coming about. What has not changed so much is actually Berlin's position, being extremely moderate and extremely careful when it comes to China and not taking a lead. And quite frankly, for Berlin to ask for the 17+1 format to be abolished and to not be there anymore because it creates problems for European unity. And at the same time, going ahead with bilateral government consultations is, I think, a problem and is seen as increasingly hypocritical from other EU member states. So I think this is particularly a job for Germany to take on a proper leadership role here as well and to lead a bit by example more than it has in the past.
There is one final note that we'd love to end on just because it sort of adds a whole new dimension to our conversation. So, and Antoine was sort of alluding to parts of this earlier. There seems to be a whole new dimension to the China question for us Europeans, which is how the regime is very shrewdly exploiting cultural wars and kind of the internal divisions in our culture. Not exclusively as a smokescreen for its own abuses at home, but quite recently they've started doing this in a very offensive way. Where we saw, I believe this was last month, a lot of the diplomatic wires have started to urge countries such as France and the UK to address racism and things of this nature, discrimination. And I wonder, Antoine, you were sort of tangentially alluding to this with the role of corporations, because if we ask the question of, what's this woke washing, as it's been called, what's the effectiveness of it? How is China leveraging it as part of its broader posturing in Europe? And when you ask that question, it seems like corporations are really playing a role. A lot of the global American corporations have been very skittish with the China question, the Hong Kong question. They've obviously got a lot of interest in that neck of the woods. So how do you envision this issue evolving? Do you think China is going to be heightening this sort of cultural war on Europe? Do you think how do you envision this to evolve? We'll start maybe with Antoine and then turn back to Janka.
Yeah, I think they will, of course, increase the pressure on cultural wars, but also on some environmental issues. And we've seen it recently with the way the Chinese government has launched a massive campaign to criticize the Japanese decision to release some water from the Fukushima plant to the Pacific Ocean. And you can see that in the Chinese public communication, the main objective was to kind of but raise awareness within the Western public opinion and try to benefit from that environmental awareness in Europe to criticize Japan and de facto to isolate Japan. So I think on cultural wars, on the green issues and climate change issues, etc., China will keep on doing it. But what is the most important, once again, is that we need to be aware of our own imperfection, our own shortcomings. We need to acknowledge them, to discuss them, to do it publicly. That's something that China is sometimes criticizing us for not doing. We are doing it, and we need to make it known. We make mistakes. We take step backs sometimes. We've had a lot of challenges in our recent history, and we need to address all of these issues. That's something that China cannot do. If we stop, let's say, being who we are, if we stop being progressive, if we stop being very democratic, if we stop acknowledging our shortcomings, China will benefit from it. And let's say, double standards from China will be fueled, if I may put it this way, by our own shortcomings. And in the so-called systemic rivalry between the EU and China, we need to make very good use of our democratic, if I may call it this way, identity. The more we openly discuss it, the more we acknowledge our imperfection, the more we try to have a more perfect union, let's say, within the European Union, or a more perfect society within our national states, the more immune, if I may call it this way, we will be against the Chinese attack and criticism. And that's something we need to keep doing.
Yeah, I think there's very little for me to add. Antoine has summarized that really nicely. I do think that we have to look back at our strengths and see how we can have a positive vision also for the world and not think so defensively when it comes to China. sometimes does seem like we're building this gigantic challenge that we it seems to be like unsurmountable for the Europeans to handle and to deal with. Whereas if we actually concentrate a little bit on what we're really good at, then this is something that we can tackle. But we need a good story for ourselves as well to have the kind of confidence and positive attitude towards being an integral part of shaping the future with a very kind of European with the European footprint as well, and not necessarily just fall into that trap that says, oh, there's a great power competition and we're not part of it. I do think that that's the biggest mistake the Europeans can do. But I do see some enthusiasm also among Europeans to just kind of be out front and say, okay, so we are part of this. We can shape the future here. And if we want a rules-based international order to survive, if we want our values to survive, then it's time to fight for them a bit.
Thanks a lot, Janka. Thanks a lot, Antoine, for this fascinating conversation where we covered the war for diplomacy, as it is called, its impact, its evolution, and we showed the extent of the relationship and the rivalry between Europe and China and how it's going to evolve over the next few years. Thanks a lot to both of you, and see you next week.
So we were delighted to have two distinguished China watchers for this episode, really kind of focused around the wolf warrior diplomacy issue, but really spilling over into a range of topics. So what did you think of Janka and Antoine's answers in this episode, Francois?
Yeah, it was very interesting because they have a lot of expertise on the issue, and Antoine was a great guest to have because he was very much a direct target of this war for diplomacy in the past few weeks, when he was called a small-time thug and a crazed hyena. First of all, these insults are really funny. Like, where did they find them? It's just
François, can we stop here for a second? Can we have you walk our audience through what this expression, this turn of phrase of petite frappe? I think it's really offensive when you hear the expression in French in ways that are not necessarily vehicled and expressed in the English pronunciation. Can you kind of get into how that was received in France?
That's a good point, because small-time thug seems a bit strange, but petite frappe is a lot more aggressive in French. I think you would call the petite frappe, some kind of young gangster, I guess. Some of these, drug dealers you'd hear about in those documentaries on some of the French banlieue, stuff like that. So it was very, very strange and very aggressive. And in crazed hyena sounds like, I don't know, yen full is just, I don't know, it's just very strange insult, to be perfectly honest. It sounds like they found a 19th century dictionary of insults or something.
But it also, do you not think, would you agree that it also speaks to China's growing finesse in leveraging kind of the cultural subtleties of the countries where
I disagree. I think there was no finesse here whatsoever. There's another good example. The other day, I forget which country. I think it's the Chinese embassy in Ireland. They made this tweet where there was a very complicated parallel the post was trying to make between the Aesop fable of the wolf and the lamb. And in the end, it was very complicated. And in the end, they said, well, actually, China's a wolf, but no, we're not the wolf because we're strong. We are the wolf, we're the lamb. So it was really confusing, very complicated. It felt to me like someone who had a little bit of exposure to European culture, but kind of very strange model way, who was doing this to get likes back at home in China. So it's very strange. I don't think there's much finesse. I think the point that was made is this is largely for domestic consumption. It's to show to the Chinese that the time where the Chinese would bow down to Europe is finished. Now they are proud.
And,
yeah.
One of the things that really strikes, I mean, in this particular respect. Non, mais le problème c'est que je peux réagir un peu vite fait sur ça.
So yeah, but I think it's just not that much finesse, if anything.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and also a related one to your other question. I believe you were asking this to both of them, but the whole question around kind of where's the audience for these gimmicks? Where's the audience for these hard-edged, hardball tactics that China plays and leverages to induce really, fear in people. This is really what I sort of far-fetchedly related this to the concept of non-kinetic warfare that is now in vogue among some of the scholarly community, and they use it as a catch-all to define all of the different warfare methods that are not that don't necessarily result in physical pain or effects. Right? These are like narratives, and these are even like drones or things of that nature. So it's a pretty catch-all. It's a pretty broad catch-all. But what I thought was interesting in your question about where the audiences are is that I'm not entirely convinced that the audience is at home, and if it is, it's a very elite urban audience, sort of a segment of the Chinese elite that is acquainted with the subtleties of Western politics. I'm not sure that the kind of broad Chinese nation that the regime is building its legitimacy around is necessarily attuned to any of these diplomatic spats. I don't even think they even know about them, let alone care about them. These are. I think you've got to kind of introduce some of the diplomatic sociology around these conflicts. These are careerist, ambitious regime props, right? These are people that are very loyal to Xi Jinping. They kind of build their careers around like a very aggressive notion of loyalty, and that's kind of how that's where this is coming from. I believe.
I agree with you, Jorge, but I think you have to be careful not to underestimate the capacity of Chinese media and generally foreign media to amplify things which seem very secondary to us. This is not China, but I'm going to give you this example, which happened back in November, December of 2020. It was right after the Samuel Paty's death in France, and Emmanuel Macron had given a speech on after his death and saying we will not stop doing the religious caricatures. It's part of who we are. Blah blah blah. This speech was clearly intended for a French audience. It was never intended to be for the rest of the world. And you had Turkish propaganda media amplify it, and essentially every Turk who read the newspaper in Turkey was super aware of Macron's speech, perhaps even more than the average Frenchman. So it's very easy for Chinese media to amplify this or this aspect of a spat. I agree. I think it's probably reserved to some kind of elite. But again, China isn't a democracy, and so if you manage to give a good impression and the few party members in China that matter, well, that's still relevant. So yeah, again, I think it's for domestic audience. It doesn't have to be for the whole country, but I think it is for domestic audience.
Yeah, I want to turn to I want to ask you one of the questions we weren't able to get into, which was a really interesting question you came up with in terms of the economic tools of reaction that we can use against China. But before that, I really want to stress the contrast that I see between some of the traditional elements of narrative that China has leveraged in terms of being kind of an underdog, right, in the world, on the world stage, right, this kind of empire of the middle that is just beginning to reassert itself in the grander scheme of history, that has been not just aggressively colonized by Western powers through history, but also kind of demoted and even ridiculed, and that is now kind of coming back into the thrust of history and kind of making a big splash and claiming its due, right, and reclaiming its space. So I see a huge contrast between those traditional narratives and the ones that we're seeing emerge, which is almost a more it's almost like a fifth column version of the same. It's China in the West, China building its own narrative as an actor within our diplomatic ecosystem. It's no longer, it's more allogene, right? It's more like it's ingrained in our diplomatic space and in our diplomatic discourse in ways that weren't the case maybe in the 90s or early 2000s. And I want to ask you about this question you came up with, which is towards the end of our script, and we didn't have time to get into it. And this notion, that there seems to be a larger conversation in which China is merely one example where, we've seen with the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that authoritarian regimes in the new global order have found ways to keep their grip on power, right? Stay autocratic, stay authoritarian but by shielding themselves from global pressures, particularly economic pressures and symbolic pressures. And one of the ways that we can counteract that, per your question, is by kind of replicating some of the NATO mutual defense modes of action to the economic sphere. And you suggested that I think there's even proposals going around of, say, with some of the say the Interparliamentary Assembly on China, this global caucus of lawmakers from Anglo-Saxon countries, primarily, some of them European, but primarily Australian, Canadian, American, from New Zealand. They're coming around in this global Interparliamentary Assembly to concoct tools of counter aggression against China. And you specifically alluded to the idea of having like retaliatory tariffs and retaliatory economic tools against China's
economic Article 5, it was called. I read it a few weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal. It was written by a former Danish diplomat called Jonas Perello Plesner. I do hope I haven't butchered his name. But it's the idea about, just like in NATO's Article 5, if one of the signatories of this economic Article 5 were to be attacked for economic means, tariffs or whatnot, all the other signatories would have to retaliate by imposing tariffs. So, the example would be what's going on with Australia right now. All of the other signatories of this agreement would slap tariffs on China to dissuade China from picking one-on-one, bullying one-on-one other countries which have disagreed with China's foreign policy or domestic policy. So I think it's interesting, like a concept. I don't think we'll see anything like that anytime soon. It's very hard to do that because each country wants to keep some kind of grip on its foreign policy, and it would be a very impressive tool in theory, but in practice, I don't know. It just seems very complicated. But it's a good kind of idea to throw around. And I'm not completely convinced that ideas lead the world, but to some extent they shape the way policymakers think, and who knows.
Mm-hmm. Outstanding. Well, I too thought it was a very worthwhile episode that allows to untangle some of the different prongs of this problem, from the human rights to the economics to the culture. What I loved in terms of how each of our guests navigated the questions is that they didn't necessarily saw, as Europe has often done, these questions as being entirely separate, right? And they've gotten the memo. They've woken up to the embeddedness of these threats, and I really appreciated that in both of them. And I think you do appreciate it as well, how Janka was also self-critical with Germany's posture, yes, which is something we didn't get from John Kampner back in the early days of our show.
That is true. But we did get from Marienhard Butikov, if I remember correctly.
Exactly.
Anyways, thanks a lot for coming for another show on common decency. We're very glad to have you with us. Don't forget, there is no Geico ads on this show. So the best way for you to support us is to support by sharing, by liking, by subscribing, by writing a review. All these small things really help for us to make sure it reaches the right audience. So, no Geico ads, and on the flip side, you get to write a positive review. Win-win. Anyways, thank you very much, and see you next week.
Some people like Geico ads, Francois. Remember that.
Yes, let's not discriminate. Anyways, see you next week.
See you next week.